Historically, a number of societies were more homogenous than they are today. These populations often had a more similar ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture than they do today. Since then, some societies have been embracing multiculturalism, where multiple identities with different cultures and backgrounds live in the same country. If migrants can attain citizenship, this can have a growing impact on governance. As demographics change, the amount of influence that these different communities have over governance systems can be profound, and these changes could result in undesirable outcomes. Today, I'm going to compare some of the different approaches for creating governance systems in a multicultural society. We're going to compare some different approaches in how you could approach representation, voting, and citizenship. These factors determine who can be a representative in governance, who has voting power, and who becomes a permanent resident in the country over the long term. Two distinct approaches for determining how to handle representation, voting, and citizenship include whether they are ethnic or civic solutions. An ethnic approach would be one that only includes the ancestral population. A civic approach would be one that includes everyone that is a citizen. These approaches do not need to be adopted fully as one or another. In the same governance system, representation could be ethnically based, but voting could be civic. This combination of approaches leads to the possibility of the following viable options: ethnic representatives with ethnic voting and ethnic citizenship, ethnic representatives with civic voting and civic citizenship, ethnic representatives and capped non-ancestral representation with civic voting and civic citizenship, and finally, civic representatives with civic voting and civic citizenship. Some factors that we're concerned with include self-determination, ease of migration policy changes, risks of manipulation, disputes and conflict, and whether each approach is effective for protecting ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture. I've added an article link in the description that briefly compares these four different approaches. The outcome from this comparison is a fairly simple one. The greater the adoption of ethnic-based solutions for the governance system, the more reliable it becomes to ensure self-determination for the ancestral population and for protecting ancestry, genetics, culture, and heritage. It also becomes less problematic for making migration policy changes, such as for reversing migration decisions, and less likely that the government can easily be manipulated and controlled by non-ancestral communities. It should also help with reducing the number of disputes and conflicts that might emerge due to the changing voting power dynamics that are caused by demographic change. This problem would be avoided as the ancestral population would only be able to vote and become representatives in government. The more control that the ancestral population has over their own homeland, the more clarity there is on which distinct communities govern the nation and are protected, and which ones are only residents in the country. All of the risks around self-determination and protecting ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture become more problematic when you introduce more civic solutions into the governance system. Civic-based solutions mean you introduce more uncertainty around who has control and influence over government over the long term. It can lead to community-based political voting and representation due to identity-related ties. This can create a political environment that results in more tribalism, as each community could be competing against one another for influence and control. The voting power and representation can more easily change over time, with civic governance solutions due to changing demographics. This can increase the likelihood of potential disputes and conflict, as any differences and preferences could start to emerge through cultural differences, the representatives that are being elected, or the laws and policies that are enacted. If we plot these different approaches for representation, voting, and citizenship along a single axis, we can think about what each side of the scale means in practice. On the left side, we have more civic-based solutions, and on the right side, more ethnic-based solutions. Something that's important to distinguish is what this would actually mean in practice for people living in a society. The first thing to mention is a country could adopt any of these solutions and have a highly multicultural society, or one that only invites in a small number of migrants. The ancestral population could represent only a small percentage of the overall population, and any of these approaches for a governance system and citizenship could still be adopted. Under any of these approaches, a government can adopt policy choices that give any resident in the country the benefit from equal access to education, healthcare, and jobs, and be able to buy the same goods and services. They can also be treated equally for taxation and under any laws and regulations. They could live where they want and choose to participate in any activities or public groups in the same way as others. Migrants don't need citizenship or voting power to experience a very similar or the same daily lifestyle as the ancestral population or those that have citizenship. The main differences that do exist with these approaches involve who has control and influence over how that society operates and how that could change over time. With ethnic solutions, you can more easily guarantee the continuity of the ancestral population. These solutions are the most effective for ensuring self-determination and protecting ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture. The interests and preferences of the ancestral population would be prioritized. If the non-ancestral population don't agree with any of the changes to society, they are always welcome to leave and return to their own ancestral homeland or to reside in another country. On the civic side, you increase individual rights to the maximum degree, but this comes at the cost of protecting the interests of the ancestral population. By focusing heavily on the individual and individual rights, the governance system struggles to protect and prioritize the continuity and collective preferences of the ancestral population. It can become more difficult over time to protect their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture. The ancestral population could eventually be replaced in government, and their population could also be replaced by non-ancestral communities. The ancestral population doesn't need to accept cultural and behavioral differences that they do not agree with. The non-ancestral community wouldn't be able to easily influence the government to prevent a change of policy. The ancestral population could start to halt or reverse migration from certain communities due to behavior or conduct problems or just due to their own preferences. With a civic solution, it can become more difficult to change these types of policies and prevent these outcomes when the community that is being problematic has a large voting base and a growing amount of representation in government. The problem with civic solutions is they are more at the mercy of the interests and preferences of all non-ancestral communities, even when those preferences are not in the interests of the ancestral population. Ethnic representation, voting, and citizenship does not mean that migrants won't experience equal rights for the most important aspects of how they live their daily lives. Ethnic solutions for government and citizenship should be more reliable in protecting the international diversity of each country and their own ancestral population. It provides more certainty in the continuity of those populations and their way of life and culture. This doesn't prevent other people from being able to join their society if the ancestral population wants them to join them. The adoption of ethnic governance solutions does not prevent the adoption of multiculturalism. Ethnic governance solutions are less chaotic when embracing demographic changes, as this won't change the population that is responsible for governing the nation. This continuity of the ancestral population in government means they can more easily correct and reverse migration changes when it goes wrong. It makes it easier for them to protect their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture, and means they will more reliably retain their self-determination over the long term. The greater the differences there are between communities based on their ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture, the more compelling it becomes to adopt ethnic solutions within government for representation, voting, and citizenship. Greater differences could potentially increase the likelihood of disputes and conflict as the differences become more apparent and as the influence from those communities increase due to demographic change. Ethnic solutions provide more clarity and simplicity on who has control and custody over a piece of land, sovereignty, and self-determination as a nation-state. Migrants don't need to become citizens to enjoy the same lifestyle as the ancestral population. They could still be issued visas that last for a long period of time, or even be issued perpetual residency visas. A final thing we should talk about is whether you could apply ethnic representation and voting on specific topic areas like migration and citizenship, and then use civic representation and voting on the other areas like education, healthcare, and national security. The problem with mixing these two types of representation across different areas of government is it adds complexity. You'd have a larger and more complex vote to determine who is involved in areas that benefit from ethnic or civic representation. Foreign diplomacy, national defense, and budgeting decisions are example areas that could be compromised due to the influences and preferences from non-ancestral communities. These are areas where it could make more sense for the ancestral population to govern those areas themselves. There's a lot more simplicity in adopting one of the approaches mentioned above for all areas of government rather than blending ethnic and civic approaches across each of the different government areas. The counter-argument to this is that secure digital voting solutions will eventually emerge, and this creates more possibilities for things like liquid democracy and more direct democracy for important topic areas. This could make it a lot easier to create a more granular and targeted governance system that is more suitable for handling both ethnic and civic-based governance decisions. Another problem with many existing governments is the responsibilities of representatives. Representatives within a political party are commonly given the responsibility to govern many different areas during a fixed term like 4 or 5 years. This approach is not ideal for ensuring that specialists are responsible for managing each area of government and that they have continuity in working in that area. It isn't uncommon to see generalists in politics that only know a limited amount about the areas that they are trying to govern. The whole government system needs thinking through again. In an ideal world, you have highly skilled and competent people that deeply understand the particular area of government that they are responsible for. For instance, it would be desirable to have representatives with a background and deep expertise in buildings and infrastructure if they are the ones that end up being the representatives that handle infrastructure policy decisions. To wrap up, ethnic solutions for representation, voting, and citizenship are highly compelling if a population's objective is to protect the livelihoods and interests of the ancestral population. This can be particularly useful for ensuring the continuity of distinct communities and their way of life. It becomes much easier to protect their own ancestry, genetics, heritage, and culture when an ethnic solution is used within government. For the most part, government systems are currently broken across the world and need to be overhauled with better solutions. Ethnic approaches for representation, voting, and citizenship look like a compelling part of those future solutions. If you can think of any other approaches that I've not considered for handling multiculturalism from a governance perspective, then please do share anything in the comments. That's it for now. I'll see you all in the next one.